You see the topic of my paper on the screen, The Treasure Quest, Recapturing the Supernatural in the American Northeast. My paper I'm going to be reading is actually an abridgment of a much longer paper I've been working on for quite a while. Hopefully the condensed version makes sense. I want to say I had all these really clever puns about people making digs at me and me making digging new ground or anything, but my session commentator did not think they were very funny, so I decided not to slip them in, but I did anyway. And now that I have that out of my system, I will get going. Okay. In the early 19th century, a local stir was created in the small town of Rose, New York, when rumors began circulating that a very valuable treasure was hidden near their township. For several months afterward, masses of Rose's citizens reportedly abandoned their daily work and eagerly searched for the whispered treasure. But the treasure quest of Rose, New York was not a simple search for buried wealth. On the contrary, for many who participated, this treasure quest was a supernatural experience that incorporated unique beliefs and arcane rituals. And Rose's treasure quest was not unique in early America. Indeed, it was part of a phenomenon that began sweeping the entire American Northeast at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries. In many ways, treasure seekers from this period seem to have crafted their own supernatural world, drawing from old folklore and melding it with their Christian heritage. Participants found the locations of buried treasure by using divining rods, having prophetic dreams, or peering into magic stones. They believed that spirits and demons stood guard over any buried treasure, and treasure seekers observed complex rituals while they mined in the dark of night. This treasure quest was much more than a simple hunt for riches. For many, it seems to have been a form of spiritual expression, and a way for them to interact with the supernatural world. Not coincidentally, as treasure seeking erupted in Rose, New York, another popular and more historically conventional form of spiritual expression also began occurring in that township's vicinity. It was the middle of the Second Great Awakening, and in those years, Christian revivals became extremely popular in Western New York. During the early 1820s, there were more revivals and a greater number of conversions than in any previous period of New York's history. Numerous revivals have been documented in Wayne County, where the township of Rose was located. And so we see that while the town's inhabitants were searching for buried treasure using sometimes taboo methods and rituals, they were also attending highly charged Christian revivals and were likely more religious than they had ever been. The town of Rose is not unique in this. Treasure seeking and revivalism seem to have coincided frequently in the Northeast during the early 1800s. Considering the suddenness in which both phenomena began occurring in the same regions throughout early America, it seems very likely that some sort of relationship must have existed between treasure seeking and evangelical revivalism. It is even possible, as we will see, that treasure seeking's popularity in early America might even have been assisted by this religious revival period. But what is very clear is that there was a strong relationship between treasure seeking and the more traditional Christian religion. In the treasure quest, the act of locating buried treasure was just as important as recovering it, if not more so. Treasure seekers generally located treasure in one of three ways. The first and by far most common was the use of the divining rod. Often called rodsmen, these treasure seekers would use wooden rods, which were typically in the shape of an inverted Y, which, as one woman who claims to have witnessed it wrote, quote, "They would turn in their hands and point to where the money lay," end quote. These rods were often made of witch hazel, and they may have sometimes been prepared, as one hostile 19th century town historian put it, by, quote, "chanting or speaking some sort of diabolical incantations," end quote. A second method to find buried treasure was through dreams. According to one antagonistic newspaper, quote, "Many treasure seekers dreamed and others saw visions disclosing to them deep in the bowels of the earth rich and shining treasures," end quote. In the late 1790s, a wealthy Vermont landowner recorded in a notebook numerous treasure-seeking dreams from people he had contact with over the years. Having prophetic dreams of buried treasure was so commonplace that one man remembered his mother and another woman casually comparing notes on their recent dreams. For some treasure seekers, there was special spiritual significance in a dream occurring thrice in a row. Seer stones were the third common method in which buried treasure was often located. Seer stones were not a strictly treasure-seeking device, as they were often used for other purposes, such as finding lost objects, seeing faraway places, or predicting the future. Treasure seers usually used seer stones by placing the stone in a hat, as one witness said, quote, "in such a manner as to exclude all light except that which emanated from the stone itself," end quote. Then, while peering into the hat, the treasure seer would see what he was looking for, which of course in the case of treasure seekers was meant to be the location of the buried treasure. The ability to locate treasure using seer stones, divining rods, or prophetic dreams was widely considered a spiritual gift. Some during the period even associated dreaming of distant treasure with the religious revivals that were made popular by revivalism. Many early Americans believed that the successful use of the divining rod in particular was inspired. In one of his later revelations, Joseph Smith even lauded this ability as the gift of Aaron. Joseph Smith's father is reported to have stated that his son's ability to see treasure with a seer stone was, quote, a wonderful power which God had miraculously given him, end quote. Treasure seeking had a unique spiritual appeal that did not exactly rival traditional religion so much as it augmented it with additional beliefs and rituals. Among these beliefs were that treasure quests were typically led by someone demonstrating a supernatural gift, such as the ability to use a divining rod or see in a seer stone. Many of these gifted treasure seekers also considered it essential that the treasure quests be undertaken during the night, with one account specifying the new moon as the most appropriate time, while another gives the best time as, quote, when the full moon was directly overhead at midnight, end quote. Another near universal and important belief among treasure seekers was that buried treasure was always protected by some sort of guardian spirit. Often this guardian was the ghost of a deceased person, either of the person to whom the treasure belonged or, as with many accounts of Captain Kidd's lost treasure, of an unfortunate soul murdered and buried with the gold. According to one account, Captain Kidd, quote, after burying his treasure, made one of his men swear to guard it and then killed him and buried him above the iron chest containing the gold, end quote. And another account describes Native Americans doing something similar, and another states that an animal could actually be sacrificed and buried with the treasure for the same purpose. Often, however, the treasure's supernatural guardian was regarded as a demonic figure. Benjamin Franklin noted this as early as 1729 when he wrote, while discussing buried treasure, that it was believed that, quote, certain malicious demons who were said to haunt and guard such places, end quote. In one account, a group of treasure seekers described the appearance of a treasure guardian as Satan himself. And another account describes a group of, quote, pious Christians encountering a demon in shape of some huge monster with hideous yawning mouth and enormous white teeth, end quote. Although it often centered around this supernatural treasure guardian, the treasure quest itself was also characterized by a number of arcane rituals, which participants practiced in America as early as the beginning of the 18th century until the late 19th century. Treasure-seeking beliefs were surprisingly uniform. In 1729, Benjamin Franklin observed several treasure-seeking rituals and practices in Pennsylvania that are virtually identical to those described almost a century and a half later in New England. One of the most prevalent and fundamental rituals was the need to mark the treasure-digging site with a magic circle, drawn around the area where the group believed the treasure to be hidden. While drawing the circle, the treasure seeker would often mutter incantations, line the circle with witch hazel rods, or perhaps even sacrifice an animal. The purpose of this circle was to create a barrier that kept the treasure guardian from entering and either carrying off the treasure or confronting the treasure seekers. As long as the treasure seekers followed these rituals with exactness, it was believed that the guardian could not pass into the circle. Once the barrier was drawn, treasure seekers had to remain completely silent as they dug within the circle until the treasure was obtained. This ritual is mentioned in several independent accounts and is summarized in one as, quote, such searches for treasure must always be conducted in silence, as the sound of the human voice irritates the evil spirit who has charge of the hidden treasures, and they, the treasures, will vanish away, end quote. This belief that speaking aloud would allow the guardian to come into the circle and either confront the treasure seekers or move the treasure to another unknown location was extremely common. Despite the seeming peculiarities of these beliefs, particularly in relation to supposed 21st century Christian sensibilities, there is no evidence that any treasure seekers saw a conflict between their midnight treasure-seeking adventures and their own Christian faith. In fact, quite the opposite seems to be true. We have already seen that treasure seekers incorporated Christian motifs into the supernatural world they created, such as the absolute reality of Satan and demonic power which guarded buried treasure. Considering this, treasure-seeking might best be understood as an appendage to their Christian faith, certainly adding beliefs, superstitions, and rituals, but not detracting from their more traditional beliefs in any apparent way. Historian Alan Taylor has documented 48 specific episodes of treasure-seeking in antebellum America. Of those 48, 39 occurred between 1790 and 1830, the exact same decades that America was swept by the evangelical revivalism that characterized the Second Great Awakening. While Americans certainly participated in treasure-seeking prior to this period, because we know Benjamin Franklin remarks upon it in the early 1700s, and the phenomenon clearly traces its roots to Europe before the establishment of the American colonies, it was during the Second Great Awakening surge of Christian fervor and religious revivalism that treasure-seeking began exploding onto the scene in the American Northeast. The fact that treasure-seeking became suddenly very popular during the very same years that evangelical revivalism burst onto the New England scene is unlikely to be a coincidence. Treasure-seekers were often very religious people And though some more traditional commentators complain that treasure seeking was unchristian and, as one newspaper editor put it, quote, part of the occult sciences, end quote, treasure seekers themselves seem to have most often viewed their midnight adventures intently through the lens of their own Christian faith, and they often included aspects of traditional religion in their treasure quests. For example, some treasure seekers considered a Bible to be an essential accessory in overcoming a treasure guardian, and some even brought along prayer books. According to one account, the evil spirit protecting the treasure could be warded off by reading an excerpt from the Apocrypha, in which the angel Raphael exorcises the devil. Treasure seekers sometimes engaged in fasting and prayer before the quest, and one man claimed that he encountered a demonic treasure guardian and was able to command it, quote, in the name of the Lord Jesus, end quote. As these examples show, treasure seekers were often able to create a tangible form of interaction with the spiritual world that was perfectly compatible with their Christian faith. But interaction with the spiritual world, even in a more orthodox context, was not always condoned by the religious establishment. Scholars generally argue that the 18th century Enlightenment caused individuals to begin making distinctions between the natural and the supernatural. The Enlightenment was generally characterized by the supremacy of reason over emotion, and according to one scholar, included efforts to make religion rational and to banish the miraculous. In early America, skeptics drawn to Enlightenment thinking often ridiculed treasure seeking. One newspaper from 1825 warned that, quote, even in this enlightened age, people were willing to credit the accounts of the miraculous, end quote. And another newspaper editor printed in 1831, and he resolutely called all treasure seekers impostors. Led by this Enlightenment thinking, traditional Protestantism, versions of which were by far the most prevalent religion in early America, generally repudiated manifestations of the supernatural, whether in their eyes religious or magical. In 1810, one minister openly condemned, quote, all belief in communications between spirits and men, and in supernatural operations which are performed by spiritual assistants, end quote. The Second Great Awakening's numerous revivals and camp meetings, on the other hand, began to openly challenge these Enlightenment notions. Although doubt had been cast on the supernatural for many secular and religious leaders, scholars realize now that revivalism revived supernatural thinking by resisting the tradition of mainline Protestantism to dismiss modern claims for visions and other spiritual gifts. The revivals that characterized the Second Great Awakening began, in the view of one scholar, partly as, quote, a revolt against a religion in which revelation had become a theory, a religion that knew too much about God and tried to explain rather than to deepen the mysteries of life, end quote. Unlike in traditional religion born out of the Enlightenment, revival participants actively sought to have individual spiritual experiences, and treasure seekers appear to have searched for similar personal experiences during their midnight treasure quests. Suddenly, due to the Second Great Awakening, manifestations of spiritual gifts and visions were not only tolerated, but were even expected from the truly pious. And when these revivals freed believers to have spiritual experiences at their evangelical camp meetings, they also may have unintentionally freed them to seek out and engage in the spiritual experience of treasure seeking. The Second Great Awakening opened the doors and gave early Americans the liberty to experience God in personal and tangible ways which they had previously been denied, including perhaps with such unorthodox mediums as the treasure quest. In some cases, we can draw direct connections between treasure seeking and Christian revivalism. Methodist camp meetings and other revivals during the 1820s profoundly influenced Joseph Smith as a youth. Smith and his family were seekers, a term sometimes used to describe religious people from the period who were discontent with America's established churches. According to one scholar, these seekers, quote, emphasized the inner emotional experience rather than outward logic, end quote, and this line of thinking may have been what drew them to both revivalism and the treasure seeking. In a vision inspired by the preaching of a minister at a Methodist camp meeting, Joseph Smith claimed that God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to him, famously remembered by Mormons as the first vision, and he later said that he had interactions with an angel. But during the exact same years that Smith attended these evangelical revivals and had these visions of divine beings, he and members of his family reportedly were also active participants in the treasure quest. And some modern historians, including some at this conference, even conjecture that treasure seeking helped prepare Smith for his calling as a Christian prophet. For many like the Smiths, the supernatural experiences offered by both revivalism and by treasure seeking seem for him to have melded into a hybrid of personal spirituality, which Joseph Smith would then carry into his new religion. One sect in early America, however, incorporated treasure-seeking directly into their worship. The New Israelites, a sect in Vermont during the turn of the 19th century which claimed to be modern Jews, believed that using a divining rod was a spiritual gift and that God was personally leading them to find buried treasure. Like Joseph Smith and the early Mormons, the new Israelites sought a restoration of primitive Christianity, complete with visible gifts of the Spirit such as healing and prophecy. But as another spiritual gift, the new Israelites incorporated treasure seeking. Treasure seeking's pre-existing popular appeal attracted even more converts for the new Israelites, and it added to their spiritual enthusiasm. Like many of the later Mormons, the new Israelites saw no contradiction between treasure seeking and religion. Quite the opposite, they saw treasure seeking as a necessary component to real religion. But it was not just members of radical sects who were drawn to treasure seeking. A 19th century town history of Groton, Massachusetts, recorded that, quote, the most devout, pious, and godly Christians, end quote, participated in their local treasure quests. And it is not surprising that religious men and women were inclined to participate in treasure seeking, as historian Alan Taylor has argued that, quote, treasure seeking was part of an attempt to recapture the simplicity and the magical power which was associated with apostolic Christianity, end quote. While Protestant pastors in their sermon recollected the Bible's distant and ancient miracles, treasure seekers felt that they were experiencing the supernatural here and now during their midnight treasure quests. Treasure seeking offered its practitioners tangible interaction with the spiritual world, and these experiences certainly would have confirmed their pre-existing religious beliefs in the divine. Despite the preaching of some Orthodox ministers, there is no evidence that treasure seekers themselves viewed the treasure quest as anti-religious or anti-Christian. Indeed, the opposite seems to have been true. According to one account, a popular local treasure seeker would recruit for his band, quote, only those of a truly moral character, either belonging to the church or abstaining from profane company, end quote. Treasure seeking seems to have been, in context of the period, a spiritual event, and in many ways was interwoven with and reliant on its practitioners' Christian faith. The treasure quest involved interaction with the unseen world, and this seems to have been the very reason that many treasure seekers engaged in it. They hoped, and probably in their minds succeeded, to recapture the supernatural in a way in which traditional religion, in their view, had denied them. Treasure seeking's popularity in the early 19th century seems to have gone hand in hand with the Second Great Awakening's evangelical revivalism, which countered the anti-supernatural sentiment of the Enlightenment and opened doors for treasure seekers across the American Northeast. Although literally a search for wealth, the treasure quest was much more than that. These midnight adventures served as a quest to experience God, divinity, and the supernatural in a way that traditional religion could not provide. Thank you.